We start. Bueno, primero saludarles a todos y a cada una que nos acompañan en estas sesiones de el Seminario Internacional de Filosofía Social, quienes están aquí en la sesión de Zoom y también quienes quienes nos estarán viendo por YouTube para poder alcanzar al público que estaba interesado en este seminario. Eh, Tenemos el día de hoy al profesor Matías Lutz Bachmann, profesor honorario de la Universidad de Frankfurt, en la Universidad de Goethe. Haré entonces la presentación en inglés del profesor Matías Lutz Bachmann y entonces pasaremos ya a su plática. Cualquier pregunta que quieran, va a haber una sesión de preguntas al final de su participación y pueden, como lo habíamos comentado, lo pueden expresar o escribir la pregunta en la parte de comentarios o bien si quieren hacerla directamente pueden hacer la mano y hacérsela directamente al profesor. Ahí están las dos opciones. Entonces empiezo con la sesión. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome you, all of you. Uh, Thanks for joining us. And we are excited to have with us this time Professor Matthias Lutz Bachmann. Um, and his paper, Social Philosophy, Human Action, and the Problem of Normativity. So we start with this presentation, with this paper, the social philosophy series at UNAM in this current semester. So I'll give a presentation of Professor Lutz Bachmann, and then I give him the word. So first of all, thank you so much, Professor Lutz Bachmann, for being with us. It's a pleasure to have you here, and it's a pleasure to start with this series with your paper. And we are glad to have you here. Professor Matthias Lutz Bachmann got two PhD, one in philosophy at the Goethe University, Frankfurt, and the second one in theology at the Münster University. He has carried out research on Middle Age philosophy, philosophy of religion, ethics, and critical theory in the Frankfurt tradition, as well as on philosophy of human rights. He has published several monographs, edited books, articles, and book chapters on this subject. Some of his relevant publications are, and only I mentioned only the more relevant, maybe, or some of them because the list is really large. But I want to mention the following publications of him. The monograph Grundkurs Philosophie, the volume Ethics on Reclam, by Reclam in Germany, and the edited books Science Between Norms and Nature, Tenets, Variations, Transformations in Scientific Research, um, Komplexität, System, Evolution, eine transdisziplinaire Forschungsperspektive in Germany, Human Dignity, Perspectives from a Critical Theory of Human Rights, published in London and New York, Vermisste Tugend zur Philosophie à la Z. McIntyre, that is a publication in Berlin, Postsekularismus zur Diskussion eines unumstrittenen Begriffs, published in Campus Verlag in Frankfurt, with Amos Nascimento, a colleague from the Washington University. They edited the book Human Rights, Human Dignity, and Cosmopolitan Ideals, Essays on Critical Theory and Human Rights. As well, we can mention Unerfüllte Moderne, Neue Perspektiven auf das Werk von Charles Taylor, published in Surkamp in Berlin 2011. And with our colleague Andreas Niederberger and Philip Schenk, they published Cosmopolitanismus zur Geschichte und Zukunft eines unumstrittenen Ideas, published in Germany. And in Mexico, Professor Lutz Bachmann published with our colleague Gustavo Leiva, who is a speaker in this social philosophy series. They published the direct book Populismo y globalización en el siglo XXI in 2022. So these are some of his publications, and currently, Professor Lutz Bergmann is distinguished professor of philosophy at the Goethe University in Frankfurt, director of the Forschungskolleg Humanwissenschaften, an Institute of Advanced Studies for the Humanities and Social Sciences at the Goethe University in Frankfurt. Um, he is a principal investigator in the Cluster of Excellence on the Formation of Normative Orders, as well in the Goethe University in Frankfurt. He is founding director of the Johanna Quandt Young Academy at Goethe University, an institute for the most excellent young scholars as early researchers. And he's a co-director of the currently. Um, he's a co-director of the research group on the School of Salamanca, a collaboration between Goethe University and the Max Planck Institute for the History and Theology of Law in Frankfurt as well. So, and the curriculum vitae is quite large. I will give you a list of publications of Professor Lutz Bergmann, and I just want to remind the paper, his paper for today, and this is Social Philosophy, Human Action, and the Problem of Normativity. So, Professor Lutz Bergmann, we welcome you. We are glad to have you here, and thank you so much for accepting our invitation. I give you the word.
You, Jorge. I'm very glad that you invited me to start with this serious lecture of UNAM on social philosophy in the light of the tradition of Jürgen Habermas, who passed away last March, though March this year. And you probably forgot something, namely our relation. Just to underline the fact, you wrote your dissertation in Frankfurt, in our community, and we stayed together in a long conversation prepared by Enrique Dussel already, who invited me first to come to Mexico City. And I had a wonderful experience 25 years ago, and later Gustavo Leiva invited me as well. But Jorge Zuniga is a friend and a colleague of mine. I'm very happy that you are responsible for this series and that you invited me to start with. After this personal remark, let me come to the paper of today. It is focusing on Habermas and his legacy. Habermas has been probably the most important colleague I ever met in my life. And when I came to Frankfurt University, he was in the age to leave, but in the years between 1994 and this spring, we developed a personal and academic relationship of discussion, reflection, and mutual criticism as well. I'm not a Habermasian in terms of education. I was never a student of him. I made my studies in Frankfurt with other traditions, and including Alfred Schmidt and the first generation of critical theory like Max Horkheimer. But of course, there is much in common among Habermas and me, and you will see how I deal with his theory. But it was this relation was very personal, and insofar I can say I lost a friend when he passed away last March. Nevertheless, it is not possible to give a view on the whole work of this fabulous philosopher. He was an outstanding scholar, an important philosopher, a political figure, a public intellectual, and famous all over the world. I do not even try to give you an abridged version of interpretation. I just want to build up a path, a way into the way of his philosophy and thinking. And that is why I start my paper in the first part with a short reference to the tradition of critical theory and where Habermas is placed in this tradition. Second part is focusing on Habermas's contribution to a theory of communicative action as the basis of his what we call in German Gesellschaftstheory, or philosophy of society, societal reflection. That has to do much with his idea of human action and the dimension of the communicative dimension, which is inherent into human action. But from here, he develops a kind of criticism of the wrong developments in modern societies, destroying the conditions for adequate communicative action. And in my third part, I will refer to the question, which is the actuality of the philosophy of Habermas today, that is focusing on his theory of reason and reasoning as the outcome of the theory of communicative action. The main works I'm referring to make it very short, is first the theory of communicative action of the year 1981, firstly published, and that made his philosophical work famous all over the place, and it was followed by further stages of development. And in the third part, I'm referring to what he called his latest work, also a history of philosophy. I'm referring to in the third part. First, what are the roots? What is critical theory about? Critical theory refers to a theory of society that is in its early stages in the early 1930s. And this was inspired by the theories of Karl Marx and consequently by the philosophy of Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, with whom Marx had in his own studies and later reflections an important point of reference. Critical theory emerged under the divisive influence of a special person, namely in the first generation of Max Horkheimer, and in the later time of the first period of Theodor W. Adorno. Both we can call the founders of critical theory, even if we have to realize that many others took important place in the development of that theory. In his early essays in the Zeitschrift für Sozialforschung, Horkheimer refers to the concept of social philosophy advocated by him and the members of the Institute for Social Research in the first years as materialism. That was a reference to the Marxist tradition. This did not change until 1937, when Horkheimer introduced the term himself, critical theory in the time he was in New York as a refugee who escaped the Nazi totalitarian system in Germany. And critical theory had to describe his own theoretical program. At that time, Horkheimer and his institute were based at Columbia University in New York. He had left Germany with his wife as early as 1933, immediately after the National Socialists, the so-called National Socialists, took over power. And after stays in Geneva and Paris, he had been a visiting scholar at Columbia University alongside Friedrich Pollock since 1934. In the 1940s, they relocated the Institute for Social Research to California, where Horkheimer maintained a very close collaboration with the already mentioned Theodor W. Adorno, who was several years his junior throughout in the year 1940s. Visible evidence of this collaboration includes the 1944 work Dialectics of Enlightenment, co-authored with Theodor W. Adorno, as well as the later lectures Eclipse of Reason delivered by Horkheimer at Columbia University in New York after the end of World War II. This has been a view back to the history of the beginnings of critical theory. It was not until Horkheimer's return to Germany in 1949 and the reopening of the Institute for Social Research in Frankfurt, where the Institute's remains headquarters is until today, that the name Frankfurt School came into common use as a synonym for critical theory. In the late 1950s and 60s, a younger generation of prominent researchers emerged within critical theory group. Among the philosophers and sociologists of that second generation, the name of Jürgen Habermas is the most prominent one, besides others like Oskar Negt, Alexander Kluge, Wellmer, and even the already mentioned Alfred Schmidt. It is particularly Habermas who since the 1960s, together with his students, had exerted decisive influence on public debates in the Federal Republic of Germany and beyond, not only in the field of academic research, but also in political and debates right up to the present days. So this is the point where I come now to the program of critical theory, in which Horkheimer was the original figure, and it was continued in the later time by the influence of Jürgen Habermas. In the work of the early critical theory, it was the intention to modernize the Marxist theory of society with reference to new insight and respecting diverse developments in Western and Eastern societies. It was, nevertheless, still following the idea of Karl Marx to understand human as the producer of his own social forms of life, albeit under conditions not freely chosen, which give this human activity an unfree and irrational character. From this, however, it can be deduced that historical social practice can, and for reasons of reason must, be transformed by human beings themselves. This is the revolutionary impulse which is inherent in critical theory. That is the sense of the critical. It is not the descriptive theory which is following the idea of a reconstruction or poor description even of what is going on in modern societies, a poor diagnosis of the givenness of structures and developments, but it is a description of antagonies and potentialities to overcome these tensions and the inner irrationalities of modern society in the interest of the prosperity of development of human activities. In doing so, Horkheimer draws early on upon insights not only from Marx and Hegel, but also from Immanuel Kant's philosophy of history, through which he adheres to the idea of reason in a future society as a community of free people, like Horkheimer did define that goal. Influenced by personal persecution, exile, but above all by the manifest catastrophes of the 20th century, including the triumph of fascism and the Nazi policy of extermination, the terror and totalitarian rule of Stalinism, or like Hannah Arendt did define it as totalitarianism, the barbarism of World War II, the policy of systematically murdering millions of Jews, the Shoah, and the use of atomic bomb and other weapons of mass destruction, the assumption that humanity progresses through enlightenment and science alone, become fundamentally problematic for Horkheimer and Adorno. In their work, Dialectic of Enlightenment, I always mentioned, they raise the legitimate question, why instead of entering a truly human state is humanity sinking into a new kind of barbarism? The answer to that question leads Horkheimer and Adorno to the insight that it is the European Enlightenment itself, due to its internal constitution and contradictions, that must be regarded as the cause of that failure, of that development. The fully enlightened world, this is the first sentence of that analysis, shines under the sign of triumphant doom. With their diagnosis of an internal dialectic of enlightenment, the authors, like Walter Benjamin before them, not only call into question the optimism about progress that has prevailed since the 18th and 19th centuries and expressed in Auguste Comte and other theories, even in Hegel, but they also point to an unbroken connection dating back to the earliest days of scientific thought between science and domination, between enlightenment and subjection, and between logical mathematical calculation and pure instrumental rationalization. This is evidently not only part of the acts of contemporary barbarism made by modern technology, it is also revealed at the core of a concept of modern science whose pursuit of knowledge is limited to the establishment of supposed facts and whose physical, chemical, or biological laws are rooted in a reductionist view of humanity and nature. And this motive is still present in the latest work of Jürgen Habermas as a philosopher of the early 21st century. Yet this diagnosis of enlightenment serves the purpose of critique and overcoming the dialectic described above. In their study, Horkheimer and Adorno discuss at least three forms of self-reflection, and even that is present if we read distinctively the latest work of Jürgen Habermas. It is, according to Horkheimer and Adorno, in the year 1944, modern art, insofar as this kind of reflection is committed to principles of abstraction. It is Jewish religion. It's a biblical imperative of the prohibition of images and to the practice of not pronouncing the name of God. And above all, it is the research, the way to work out a critical theory of reasoning that reflects upon this process and the dissolution of enlightenment. And these motivations are still present in my reading of Jürgen Habermas, to whom I now turn. Second part, turning our thought on the work of Jürgen Habermas, and now I start with a reference to the theory of Habermas' action, or the idea of communicative action. Contemporary proponents of critical theory built upon the fundamental critiques that Habermas formulated in his own work against Horkheimer and Adorno. He is opposing, to a certain degree, the early attempts of Horkheimer and Adorno to build up a critical theory of reasoning. And he gives us an alternative way to reflect upon the same topic following similar intentions. Habermas accuses both elderly representatives of the first generation of critical theory of adopting a self-contradictory and therefore aporetic approach to the problem of reason, particularly with regard to the already mentioned work, The Dialectic of Enlightenment. In contrast, in his theory of communicative action, firstly published in 1981, he developed a concept of public, discursively constituted and communicatively defined reason, grounded in the modern theories of language and action, of public discourse, and the capacity of publicity. This concept of reason allows Habermas, on the one hand, to take up the motive of scientific and social criticism from the older critical theory. On the other hand, Habermas is able to ground his understanding of critical theory as what he called post-metaphysical thinking, on the basis of insights from analytical philosophy of language, American pragmatism, especially of Charles Sanders Peirce, and the traditions of modern sociology, following Emil Durkheim, Max Weber, Talcott Parsons, and many others. Building on the philosophy of Kant, Habermas developed not only an idea of the normative foundation for the ethics of discourse, which gives us the clue for his understanding of normativity. He conceived in collaboration with Karl Otto App, but also the basis and the basic tenets of his deliberative theory of democracy and the idea of the necessity of the rule of law in Faktizität und Geltung, the juridical theory of Habermas, published firstly in the year 1992. Here, he sets forth that reason can argue in favor of a lasting constitutionalization of public law within a strong transnational constitution of law and a new legal order for the international community of states. These are not least the normative questions concerning a democratic constitution, not only within single nation states, but for what I would call world politics and a just order of politics and economy in the world, committed to the prohibition of the use of force enshrined in the UN Charter that occupy our protests against the actual military interventions of the big powers in the world. In his theory of communicative action, Habermas claimed to lay down the categorical fundaments, the fundaments of judgment for a critical theory of modern society. Here, he is interested to identify what he called the proper sense and meaning of the rationality of communicative acting, either in the private sphere of the life world or in the public sphere. According to Habermas' view, the communicative action constitutes the mutual goal of understanding among humans and finding consents, even in not only society, politics, but as a mode for ethical consensus as well as in scientific discourse on questions of true objectivity. That analysis allowed him to identify the problematic imperatives penetrating the life world of humans and penetrating that possibilities of human action as a communicative practice. The migration of different imperatives into the life world was defined as acts of colonization, as infringements of different subsystems and potential destruction of the before identified communicative action and its own inherent rationality and possibilities to constitute understanding and mutual agreement. According to Habermas, the colonization of the life world is realized by subsystems of our capitalist societies and their logics of, on the one side, money accumulation, and on the other side, of state bureaucratic administration. Both developments lead to a self-alienation of humans and have destructive consequences for the orientation of human interaction towards communicative understanding and free reasoning. These consequences may destruct finally not only the life world itself and its own logics, but also the rationality of the finally, first, the scientific research for truth, second, the reflection of the normative questions in the practical sphere of human interaction concerning with the moral and ethical dimensions, and thirdly, the understanding of culture art and symbolic communication of humans vis-à-vis the world and the other in the cultural media. These three modes of proper use of language understood as a special type of action constitute, according to Habermas, the reasonable horizon of the human's way to apply our capacity to interfere with ourselves, the others, and with the world as a whole in the different dimensions of the meaning of the world. The interconnectedness of the three distinguished and different ways to achieve insight calls the unit of human reasoning. That is an important topic. The inherent unity of human reasoning is nothing else than the interconnectedness of different ways to apply that kind of reasoning on the basis of a practical constellation of argumentation. Like he wrote in the first paragraph of his theory of communicative action of the year 1981, I quote, "The rationality of opinions and actions is a topic which has been discussed traditionally in philosophy. Philosophical thinking could be defined as the self-reflection of reason in human cognition, in human language, and in human acting. The main topic," so he concludes, "of philosophy is therefore reason." End of quotation. Insofar, we can agree with that statement of Habermas from the year 1981. The concept of reason was not only the main topic of Horkheimer and Adorno compared to the dialectics of enlightenment, but it has been and is still at the center of the Habermasian theory of communicative action as a fundament for his theory of society today. Reason and human reasoning always defined the center of Habermas' theory. It is especially true for his latest big grand work, auch eine Geschichte der Philosophie, also a history of philosophy, published in 2017. So 9 years ago. Here, he is dealing with the project of what he called a genealogy of post-metaphysical thinking. And post-metaphysical thinking is the only way to deal with philosophy, according to him. Insofar, it has to do this genealogy with the possibility of philosophy today. And his reconstruction of the emergence of that kind of reasoning, he is naming the Occidental constellation of faith and knowledge. That is focused on that basic goal to work out a concept of what he called not only reasoning, but of reasonable freedom, which is the subtitle of book 2 of the 2 volumes of his latest work. I come now to the third part of my presentation, and I hope I'm still good in time. Jorge, if I'm overdrawing my time slot and possibilities, please give me a hint, and then I come to an earlier end. I ask now what is left of Jürgen Habermas's philosophy after he passed personally away. What is left? More than just a lasting memory, good memories of discussions with him and exchange even sometimes in a mutual way of criticism. Will his philosophy endure? And that includes the theory of society and public law and the theory of reasoning as a contribution to contemporary modern thought, to our life world, so to speak, after he died? Or will he fare the same as other prominent proponents of sophisticated theories in the modern era who were quickly forgotten upon their passing? Certainly not. My answer to that question of what will become of Jürgen Habermas' theory after Habermas is, by its very nature, merely an attempt, a personal attempt, at an answer among many voices reflecting the same topic. I draw on the practice of contentious dialogue with Habermas, and I have cultivated through which I attempt to highlight his continued relevance and enduring significance. This approach aims for understanding through argumentation, and insofar, I would like to point out some of the open questions, some of the ambivalences in Jürgen Habermas' final work, which, however, must be evaluated differently. These three ambivalences I will now refer to are not the result of certain inconsistencies of his thinking. Not at all. Rather, they are intricately linked to the very issue of that what he always has been reflected upon, namely the qualification and justification of the role, task, and program of philosophy today. Determining this is evidently more difficult than anticipated by himself. It is precisely something we have to continue. And I see here future debates emerging. This is where the philosophical challenges lie that we must reflect even after Habermas, but with him as our counterpart and reference, with reference to his texts. The ambivalences I would like to name now have to do, on the one side, with certain uncertainties concerning the analysis of the systems of our societies we are living in, especially with his neglecting of the interior problems of economy and some problems of politics, especially in the system of international politics. On the other side, these ambivalences do emerge within the philosophical dimension of his theory. And insofar this is true, let me give you some hints, some access to what I mean by reflecting three programmatic concepts. First, the concept of post-metaphysical thinking. Second, the project of what he called de-transcendentalization of transcendental philosophy, especially of Kant. And third, I refer very shortly to his discourse on the phenomenon of the post-secular. All these concepts are related, directly or indirectly, to his position on the questions which are defining the proper nature or understanding of reasoning. Reasoning or public reasoning of humans separated from, on the one side, the status of science and its special way of rationalization, and on the other side, differentiated from what he called the language of religion. According to Habermas, there is finally a point of contact between faith and reason, and I will refer to in the last paragraph or sentences of my paper. So first, I refer to the very basic self-descriptive concept of post-metaphysical thinking as the outcome of the reflection and the question, what is philosophy about and how could we define reason as the main topic of philosophical reflection since philosophy emerged in the Western tradition. Habermas defines the role, task, and program of philosophy through that concept of post-metaphysical thinking. Only as post-metaphysical thinking, philosophy is possible today, according to him. In doing so, he draws on themes of the Enlightenment from Kant through Herder, Schleiermacher, Humboldt, and Hegel, and builds on the work of the left Hegelians, of Marx, of Kierkegaard, and in particular of Charles Sanders Peirce, while seeking to counter a different way of philosophy, the naturalistic variant of enlightenment and scientific reflection, which has been developed quite successfully from Hume to the present days. So he distinguishes two ways of enlightenment, and the one way is defined according to him through the Kantian tradition, and the other way goes back to David Hume. And his idea of post-metaphysical thinking is seen and defined as a continuation of the Kantian way to think philosophically. With this line of argument, Habermas draws on themes from earlier critical theory, particularly Horkheimer's and Adorno's dialectic of enlightenment, as we have seen. But he is doing that job in his own way. Habermas charts his own unique course, meta-critique, giving of that kind of rationality, not least because of the way he engages with phenomenology and hermeneutics, philosophy of language, and pragmatism. Yet it is precisely this engagement with these diverse scholarly traditions that also leads the concept of reason developed by Habermas into particular problematic situations. His constant concern is to preserve the essence of philosophy, so to speak, in the face of the widespread tendency to methodologically align the mode of thought in philosophy with the scientific naturalism. In substance, that means that a convincing concept of reason must be elaborated according to him, one that scientism dispenses with by replacing reason with the tools of mathematical algorithms and modeling. At the same time, Habermas defends the idea of a unity of reason in the multiplicity of its voices a notion he repeatedly brings into play, particularly in opposition to Richard Rorty and his extreme concept of hermeneutics, which does give up the reference of human speech to truth, objectivity, and more normative orientation as a possible general way of universalist orientation. The concept of reason that Habermas advances against the both aforementioned concept of rationalities is also intended to be more comprehensive and at the same time to incorporate 4 dimensions. The epistemic perspective, the first person singular, the second person singular, the third person singular, and the first person plural, especially when we have to deal with communities and political constitution. At the same time, it builds upon the cognitively relevant background insight that we, as language and our beings, we as humans, have always incorporated from our respective life worlds into our cognition and action, and thus also into the practice of our sciences and into politics. In this way, Habermas's philosophically grounded concept of reason can be clearly distinguished from the rational mode of cognition in the natural sciences, whose modeling recognizes only the third person singular perspective, and thus represents a concept of rationality that is, compared to Habermas's concept, clearly underdeveloped. The same applies to its distinction between human rational capacity and the deflation of human cognition brought about by radical hermeneutic theories. Nevertheless, his discussion of philosophy as post-metaphysical thinking contains an ambiguous normative description of reason. This has to do with Habermas's use of the concept of metaphysics, which is the counterpart of the post-metaphysical. In his use of the term, it is, according to my view, not clear whether or not post-metaphysical thinking may or even should incorporate transformed motives of classical metaphysics, or whether metaphysics as such, that is, in its entirety, must be negated, as the Vienna Circle had proposed 100 years ago. We must also ask ourselves what meaning the prefix after conveys. Evidently, it has, among other things, a normative and a temporal connotation. After. That raises the further question of the constitution of philosophy and philosophical insight, whether or not it is constituted through and by its historical development. Which role does history and the history of spirit plays in the constitution of philosophy? And that implies a further question of whether there is something like a progress in the history of philosophy comparable to that progress in the science. But the progress in the science has to do with technology and the capacity to interfere with what we call the objective world. What is the analogy compared to philosophy? And how is that kind of progress to be demonstrated philosophically by philosophical reason itself? As well, we know Habermas affirms that question by reconstructing the whole history of Western philosophy as a grand learning process that, as it were, converges on his own philosophical position. He seems to think that he explained and demonstrated the final and highest insight of the development of philosophy. But hadn't Hegel already claimed that position for himself? Albeit with arguments rooted in the idealistic premises of his philosophy, that means with arguments that Habermas cannot adopt for himself. The similarity of his argumentation to that of a practically expanded Hegel, or pragmatically new interpretation of Hegel in Giles Sanders Peirce, raises more questions that we can find, according to my reading, convincing answers in Habermas's own work. What, and this is one of the final questions referring to the concept of post-metaphysical thinking, what if the reason he calls for were in fact to prove itself in our democratic public sphere to be a form of unreason? There is no guarantee that reasoning is, as a phenomenon of the practical dimension of Western democracy, constituting a rational fundament. And to take the question further, can the political regression of constitutional states and democratic publicities, as we are currently witnessing worldwide, refute the counterfactual optimism articulated in the discourse of a reason that, to paraphrase Peirce and Habermas, realizes itself in the public sphere? Is the public sphere indeed the form of realization of reasoning? Or must we, as philosophers, be more modest and, following the spirit of Kant, rather speak of a practical reason which should be realized in state and societal organization and is not realized there, like Hegel explained it in the term of objective reason? That distinction between realization and should be realized implies important philosophical premises and consequences, and that has to do with the second point I would like to refer to, namely the problem of the de-transcendentalization of Kant in Habermas's theory of reason. So 5 minutes to go. I hope this is still okay. Here too, Habermas follows premises he derives from Hegel's philosophy and his concept of progress, historic progress, realization of reason in history of society and societal organizations, even in the Prussian state. That is Hegel. But can Habermas really follow premises of that kind of objective reasoning in Hegel's tradition, even if he is following the left Hegelian criticisms of Hegel? The question I'm focusing has to do with his approach in his genealogy of post-metaphysical thought, a circumstance that poses specific problems. With regard to the concept of detranscendentalization, I would like to point at the fact that Habermas is here following it's somehow unclear and ambiguous program. The program is defined to extend, firstly, the expansion of the concept of the knowing subjects, Erkenntnissubjekt, to the diversity of us, the historical subjects, in different ways of living, societies, and historical contexts. But the problem he is faced by is that there are some problems inherent in that intention. The question raises, how can the philosophical idea of a necessary unit of reason, which is in the early Habermas a primary object of definition of reasoning, still be salvaged, or at least made reasonable, plausible, if we are no longer permitted, according to him, to postulate any necessities of thought in philosophy? Is it sufficient, as Habermas himself suggests, to refer solely to the fundamental fallibility of human cognition? The question of the necessary conditions of the possibility of our cognition for practical as well as for theoretical use of reason was that classical problem and topic of transcendental philosophy, particularly in the work of Kant. In Kant's work, it also forms the basis for the concept of rational freedom, understood in a normative sense, which underpins his moral philosophy, his legal theory, and political philosophy, and which makes the idea possible of the universalization of normative claims of rules in law and politics. Habermas seeks to set aside Kant's answer to that question through his project of detranscendentalization of Kant's philosophy, without offering a sufficient, let me say, replacement for them. It was precisely at this point that a fundamental debate erupted between him and his friend and colleague Karl Otto Appel, a debate that neither side was able to resolve philosophically during their lifetimes. Here, I think, it becomes clear that open questions remain, and we have to work on further clarifications. I come to the last ambiguity to be discussed in continued debate in the future with the work of Habermas. That has to do with the ambiguity of his way to apply the language of secular reasoning and the concept of post-secularity. We encounter that kind of ambivalence. On the one hand, Habermas uses the term the post-secular to make clear that the rejection of the idea that the religious talk of God may have some cognitive relevance that is neglected by the 19th century scientism and the atheist worldviews, but according to Habermas, cannot be continued this way under conditions of post-secular and post-metaphysical thinking. On the other hand, however, Habermas argues that reason itself is secular and not post-secular, even though it must be aware of the post-secular context in public sphere in which it operates. Evidently, both terms, secular and post-secular, represent two distinctive ways in which Habermas views religious faith. On the one hand, as a philosopher and social scientist himself, who seeks knowledge as epistemologically and radically separate from religious faith. On the other hand, we see him here accepting the situation of humans like himself, rooted in the life world. People to whom this epistemological separation of knowledge and faith does not apply. For we are human beings who, in our life world, have always been and continue to be constantly engaged with fundamental questions of our existence and our lives, with the experience of our contingency and uniqueness, resumption of responsibility, with normativity, with questions of life and death, with coming to terms with happiness and finitude, with great hopes and at times profound disappointments, with grief and farewell. Habermas knows these questions cannot be answered sufficiently or even adequately by the epistemological program of the sciences, nor by the means of philosophy according to his program of post-metaphysical thinking that is aware of its own fallibility, precisely because and to the extent that it is constituted to post-metaphysical thinking. Nor, however, that is his insight, can secular reasoning or public reasoning simply set these questions of the life world aside or ignore them without suffering irreparable damage itself, and thereby also endangering the project of modernity and human freedom. At the end of his genealogy of post-metaphysical thinking, Habermas describes that problematic and reflected constellation of knowledge and belief in the following words. I quote, "Secular modernity has turned away from the transcendent for good reasons, namely, that is no quotation, my explanation, due to an understanding of the pure epistemological limits of the cognitive competence of both science and secular reason with regard to the subject of transcendence and to the dimension of the life world." But, Habermas writes, reason itself, and this is important, would wither away with the disappearance of any thought that transcends the entirety of what exists in the world. And he adds the following thought with reference to Adorno. The defense against this entropy is a point of contact between post-metaphysical thought or philosophy and religious consciousness, as long as the latter is embodied in liturgical practice of communities of believers and thus assert itself as a present form of the Spirit. In this context, religious consciousness is sustained by a faith that, in the light of realization of the fallibility of all forms of human knowledge, entrusts itself to the notion of God as a saving counterpart to humanity. In this way, he summarizes his position, and these are the very last sentences in the final work of Habermas, auch eine Geschichte der Philosophie, also a history of philosophy. Within the life world, the power of reason's word creating spontaneity is effective, among other things, because this reason can intellectually transcend the boundaries of the world in acts of a transcendence from within. Yet this power can dry up, for although it is inherent in secular reason itself, it is not transcendentally guaranteed, and that means it is not based on the idea of a transcendental necessity of thought. Nor, however, it can be secured in the long term through philosophical reflection alone. For that reason, Habermas identifies what he called himself a point of contact between knowledge and faith, or reason and religion. Because, and to the extent that faith can open access to another kind of transcendence, which is called in Habermas's own language a strong transcendence, which is not a transcendence from within, but a transcendence which breaks from outside into the world. But it is evident that here is an ambiguity left in the Habermas's own position, which is not finally clarified, which sets up further problems of A, understanding, and B, legitimation and situation of good reasoning. And insofar, I would say the question of post-metaphysical program of reason, the program of detranscendentalization, and the question of the relationship of philosophy and religion, or secular reasoning and post-secular consolation and acceptance of the participation of religion in a certain way, understood and defined. These are topics to be discussed as important categorical figures for the philosophy of Jürgen Habermas and its presence in our modern world, and the proof of the capacity of his theory to build up a categorical fundament for a theory of human, not only interaction, but of a theory of human society. Thank you very much for your attendance.
Thank you so much, Professor Lutz Bergman, for this big topic and for your presentation. And it was quite inspiring for many of us who are interested on critical theory and on Habermas' political, practical, theoretical philosophy. So thank you so much. We appreciate your presentation, your insights, your knowledge about this important and relevant philosopher of the 20th century who passed away in recent months. So we have already a question in the commentaries. You can, I don't know if you can see this comment by Oscar David, Professor Lutz Bergman.
Yes.
Yeah. So if you want, you can read it and maybe give a reaction about it.
Excuse me, I lost it somewhere.
Yeah. So
Uh,
the question is literally as follows. Perhaps this is a very simple question, says Oscar David. What was the stand of Habermas about, or what would be his thoughts regarding to the ethical and political implications of
oh,
AI?
okay, yes. He was very uh, reflexive on that topic in his final years. He worked through the topic of the influence of AI for human intelligence in general and the effects of AI for society and the process of public reasoning in society. And he made clear that the constitution of publicity based on artificial intelligence uh, is quite different compared to the constitution of publicity in the 18th century. As you probably know, his um, habilitation work, half of the habilitation of Habermas, the second big book, was dealing with the constitution of uh, publicity in 18th century European societies um, and the consequences for the philosophical, the scientific, and the political institutions. And that kind of uh, emergence of a dimension of public rationalization, of dispute, what in Kant's words was defined as the element of um, enlightenment. Enlightenment defined in Kant's words by uh, the possibility to apply your own personal reasoning in public affairs, not as a private opinion uh, just in your family or in the circumstances of a private uh, conversation. This political and societal dimension of reasoning constituted um, his Habermas's own view of as a mode of public reasoning in modern societies. And he, in the beginning of the internet, uh, had the idea this is a huge help for the democratization um, of that instrument to participate, to give much more people the possibility to participate in the public discourses like we do today. We can discuss over the Atlantic Ocean by the means of online capacity and internet. But on the other side, and this is something he worked out, um, this is not publicly enough. It is organized in terms of private uh, organizations, private companies who own the rights, who possess the means and define the norms and the way how the communication is transmitted. And it's especially this becomes true for the artificial intelligence, which is totally in the hand of private companies or of states, but without any public control, without the capacity of humans to control the algorithms by which the dynamic of that instrument is developed. And insofar, he focused on the problematic side, the side of the privatization of publicity, to make it this way, to point at this kind of inherent dialectics of alienation, of self-destructive developments. It is an own, a very actual example for what Adorno Horkheimer called the dialectics of enlightenment, something which has the potential for something inclusive, is working exclusively in the interest of whomever, state or powers which can escape public control. And this dialectics was something he was pointing at, but he did not work out, to be honest, a huge new theory of AI in his final years. This is something he has seen as in its chances and counter chances, in its possibilities and in its problematic effects. And he warned us to underestimate the dynamic of these developments against democratic control, against the participation of the public and the everyday man and woman in that process. The overturn of humans by algorithms and mechanisms in the hand of some dark, opaque interests was something he was referring to. Excuse me for being probably too long in my answering. I try to give you shorter answers for the next upcoming questions. Thank you.
No, it's okay, Professor Lutz Bergman. We are here to discuss and to have a dialogue about it. So it's nice to have you here with these answers. And we have many other comments and questions. I don't know if you can see the box with where the commentaries. We have many. So at least I can see here the two following. One of Rosy Urquijo and the other one of Diego Lopez. So if you can read them or you can see them, I can read them for you, Professor Lutz Bergman.
It would be helpful. I can't see some of them, but it is not probably not in the right order you mentioned.
Okay.
Please,
I can
Jorge,
read it.
if you can give me a short summarized version of the question, please.
Yeah, sure,
go ahead.
Sure. So Rosy Urquijo is asking, could you elaborate on the topic of instrumental rationality according to Habermas? So maybe she's asking if you could go more in detail about this instrumental rationality in Habermas theory, and the other one is of Diego Lopez, and he's asking. How can we interpret now fascism in light of Habermas' philosophy? Is it perhaps yet another symptom of the triumph of capitalism irrationality? If not, he's asking, what political alternatives remain for us? So maybe we can stay with these two questions.
Yeah.
If we will have time, we can go
Very
further.
fundamental questions. Yeah. Thank you for all questions you raise. Uh, like I thank the first one as well on AI, which is such an important topic for us and becoming more and more important. Instrumental reasoning is a very complicated, but on the other side, even easy topic in Habermas. Instrumental reasoning, that is a concept which comes from Max Horkheimer's lectures in the Eclipse of Reason. Eclipse of Reason, I mentioned that work, was the analysis of the modern way to think rational by limiting rationality to something like an instrument for certain goals defined by the technical idea and the mathematical methods of the instrument. And we could say, according to Habermas, this is a kind of human acting which has its own legitimate and necessary place. But to understand reasoning in terms of instrumental rationalization, that would exclude important dimensions of reasoning out of rationality, especially the intersubjective way of self and self-understanding and conscience orientation, to discuss especially questions of normativity, of the moral issues, of responsibility, and practical norms, that instrumental reasoning would not be able to reach the point of rationalization, which is necessary in that context. So, instrumental reasoning is a way of strategic acting where it is appropriate. The instrumental reasoning is necessary in all technological contexts. Instrumental reasoning has its proper place, but it is not the right way to discuss and to reach the goal of reflection and cognition when it comes to intersubjectivity, to questions of human identity and communitarian ways of understanding and living together. And insofar as instrumental reasoning is in itself to be seen as part of a much more comprehensive view of reasoning, which is represented in the way he interprets reasoning from the first persons, the second persons, the third person, and the first singular and the first person plural perspective in forms of argumentation. I hope this is a first and in itself somehow plausible a way to react on your question. He criticizes instrumental reasoning not as such, like Horkheimer, but he is aware of the limits of instrumental reasoning, and he is presenting a much more coherent and outreaching concept of reasoning in his own social and philosophical theory. Fascism, the other question, is something Habermas personally experienced as a young child and an adolescent young man. He was raised in Germany in the time of the 30s. He was born in 1920. Oh, I forgot. Sometimes in the late 20s. And so he had personal memories. And he was aware after the end of Nazi dictatorship about the catastrophic and wrong and fundamentally barbarous nature of this kind of political system. And of course, he accepted the analysis that this kind of political system was a specific answer of political parties in Europe reacting on the big crisis of capitalist economy of that time. Insofar, there is a capitalist necessity or constellation identified out of which fascism emerged, but it was not such a simple explanation he gave. He has pointed to certain cultural and societal, much more complex histories and constellations out of which fascism emerged. It has to do not only with the problem emerging in an economic crisis, but has very special conditions in each country. We shouldn't forget the Spanish fascism was highly different in a different society compared to the Italian constellation. And the Italian constellation, where the word of fascism became prominent, was different compared to the constellation of the National Socialism, which was much further than a pure fascist one-party and leader-oriented system of political organization. Especially the way to exterminate Jewish and other members of European societies, especially in Germany, but in all countries conquered by the German army as well. The way to kill and to legitimize to kill millions of people in a way of organized, state-organized industrial murdering was much more than just fascism. It was a very special way. We can call it fascism, since there are the political elements of fascism as well in Germany present, and the Hitler movement oriented towards the Mussolini movement. But we shouldn't oversee the differences. And the German example in history of the 20th century was the most prominent and most barbarian political and cultural and ideological movement we have seen until that point in human history. Insofar, there is a relation of fascism and capitalism. even in Habermas's view, that capitalist crisis is not enough to point at in order to understand where especially the German National Socialism movement came from. It has roots in the 19th century and older roots and longer roots in the cultural and political ideologies. So, insofar, um, it is important to point at this point, since Habermas was always aware of the danger that that kind of mentality of national socialist mentalities, ideologies, habits, and world explanations could come back in the German or European, Austrian, and other societies. And it is something I'm very trist to explain that we are encountering today. We have back in Germany a party with very strong roots, evident roots in the tradition of National Socialism, which is much further than just fascism. And this party is something Habermas was aware in his late days, but he was always discussing that topic in earlier days in the so-called Historikerstreit, the open dispute of the historians on the history of Germany. He was pointing at these problems in the, sometimes we call it conservative mentalities, to ignore these very deep roots of especially anti-Semitism and other ideologies by which the German National Socialism has been constituted and defined. And insofar, the answer is Habermas fought against all these tendencies in German politics, history, and culture until his final days. And he was really a fighter against the right wing and fascist and neo-national socialist mentalities, which we are confronted with in German society. In the younger generation, not the older ones, just. There is nobody left, I would say, of the old German nationalist party for biological reasons. So it is too far away. But the ideologies are back, and the anti-democratic mentalities, the anti-Semitic, the mentality against foreigners, even the talk of not racist but cultural importance of German and in part European exceptionalist improvements is back. We see tendencies like that in France, in Belgium, in the Netherlands, in Italy, though it is a complex constellation, and where we find that constellation, we have to fight again there. And in terms of American politics, I would say the Trump ideology is not easily to be defined by fascism. It is a new form of totalitarianist view with similarities to earlier fascist movements, but there is no fascist party to be seen. and we cannot identify the militarist dimension. He is an anti-democratic president who undermines the democratic tradition and constitution of the states of the United States. And he's a racist, of course. But that is all not element enough to call it easily fascism. It has similarities, but we have to identify the new means of governing, including, first question, the algorithms of AI and other means and institutions. But in the end, Trump is a fully idiot. He is an irrational personality. People behind him may be much more dangerous, even in that case, than himself. This is my personal view. I had conversations with Habermas on that topic, and he had similar observations.
Thank you so much, Professor Lutz Bergman. We have a big comment on an important comment, interesting, on Foucault's philosophy and the critical theory tradition, and then we have a question formulated by Adjani Gabriela, and she is asking, she's interested on what you think about. Okay, yeah. She asks if communicative rationality seeks mutual understanding and consensus. Can that understanding actually be achieved in societies marked by deepened inequality? So if consensus can be reached in societies with a deepened inequality, that is the question. I think in the sense of discourse ethics, maybe, no?
It's interesting. Thank you for this very important question as well. The idea of the consens as inherent goal of communicative acting of humans, understanding argumentation as a form of practicing this kind of rationality, following certain rules of fair and equal participation of all who want to give their opinions and reasons for their opinions in a practical constellation. This idea of consens is, of course, a philosophical abstraction. It is an abstract goal or final dimension, defines where argumentation is reaching at or is interested in to come out. And in the words of Carlo Apel, who made it much clearer, according to my view, than Habermas, this is an ongoing process, never ending, so to speak. It is comes to an end when world history ends, according to Apel, and that gives us an impression of the contrafactual idea or idealistic idea which is expressed in the structure of consens, but that has implications, normative implications for the way how we organize our conversation, how we organize our discussions, how we have to follow normatively ways of accept the equal state of each in a given constellation or a given society or a given community of even scientists or political partners in a given political entity. On the other side, and this is the Foucault perspective, in a society where inequalities are constitutive for the functioning of the system of economy, for the system of political power and governance, inequality is a reality. And there is a tension. There is a tension which is present in Habermas's own theory. And when I mentioned some very shortly in my talk, some unclearness in Habermas, that has to do, and I pointed at the fact that the empirical evidence of some of his assumptions are not proved and worked out coherently enough. I wanted to explain the same. In a society and in a given political community where inequality is constitutive, the idea of consent-oriented argumentation is nothing else than a Kantian idea that there should be changed something. And we cannot identify the practice of argumentation, even of democratic participation, as a realization of reasoning as such, like Habermas did explain in the light of his understanding of Hegel and of Peirce. I think there is a problematic dimension or inconsistency in Habermas's own view. As a Kantian philosopher, I declare myself as being much more in that tradition. We can pick up much better the evidence of Foucault and the evidence that power and not equal state of humans is a determining factor of the given society, given politics, not only in economy, but in the political system, as well in publicity, where power relations define who has which impact on what, like we have seen in the example of AI as well. And then we can contrast the analysis of inequality as a basic problem, as a problem we can criticize. This is something which is not evident enough for me in the Foucault camp. Why should and could we normatively criticize inequality without an idea of equal state of humans and its necessity to be performed and to be realized in a tradition of Kant and transcendental philosophy? We cannot criticize that state. And I would like to combine the analysis of inequalities and the normative idea that societies, politics, economy should be transformed, reformed, or revolutionized in a certain direction where we have to go. And that has to do with the idea to build up communities, political structures, and economies much more based than today on justice, on equal participation, and on happiness and good life of all. I hope I could give some hint for my critical comment on Habermas and how to apply to the question of the dialectics of consensus and inequality. Sometimes the talk on consensus, an equal state of humans, can under can support to uh, um, ignore the fact of inequality as the right description of the given constellation we are living in. And we have to see both the dimension of the empirical evidence and the critical dimension to overcome with a certain kind of normative necessity the state of inequality towards a state of more and more participation and equal state of humans.
Thank you again, Professor Lutz Bergman. So all those were the comments and questions. So I think I want to thank you for your talk and for your inspiring paper again on Habermas philosophy. And I personally appreciate that you opened this lecture series on social philosophy in memoriam of Jürgen Habermas. If you want to add something else, dear Professor Lutz Bergman, please.
I would like to thank you for your openness, for your interest, and for your engagement, not only in philosophy, but for the talk among us between the Americans and the Europeans as members of one world community which we have to build up, which is not there, but factually we are interconnected, and we should, this is a normative plea, we should look out for appropriate and much more just relations, not only in economy and politics and military dimensions, but even in philosophy and science relations among our universities. It is necessary to have the cultural exchange for mutual understanding and human flourishing. And insofar, I thank you a lot for your questions. I can see many wonderful human faces in the internet dimension. I thank you for your presence, and I would like, this is my last wish, to meet you in person wherever that may be possible. This personal exchange is constituted best by personal encountering. So the vis-a-vis communication, according to Emmanuel Levinas, the dialogue is the best form for the dialectics of reflection, which is the task of philosophy. And I thank you, Jorge, and your colleagues from UNAM and other places to give us the chance to come together and hopefully to continue. Thank you.
Sure, we'll do it. Thank you, Professor Lutz Bergman, and we keep in touch, and we organize something in presence, I hope, in the coming time. So, thank you so much, all of you. Gracias a todos. Nada más recordarles que la próxima semana, en la sesión 2, tendremos a la profesora Elisabetta Di Castro con su plática, su ponencia, Nancy Fraser, de la crítica a Habermas a la propuesta del capitalismo caníbal. Muchas gracias a todos y cada una de ustedes, también a que nos están viendo por YouTube. Professor Lutz Bergman, it's a pleasure to have you here, and thank you so much again.
Wish you all the best, and hopefully we can exchange in peaceful times. War is the most dangerous constellation we are confronted with worldwide today. So let's fight for peace and justice.
Yeah, sure, sure. Okay. See
Bye
you.
bye.